The box shouldn't have been there. Arthur Brennan had lived in this house for 43 years, knew every creak in the floorboards, every water stain on the ceiling, every corner where dust gathered despite his weekly cleaning. But the attic crawl space above the garage had never held anything except pink insulation and the skeletal framework of 2x4s. Until today. He'd only gone up there because the December rain had found a new way inside, dripping steadily onto the concrete floor where he'd planned to park the Buick. At 72, climbing ladders required planning. He'd waited until the rain stopped, positioned the aluminum stepladder carefully, and hauled himself up through the access panel with the deliberate movements of a man who'd learned that haste led to emergency rooms. The box sat wedged between two rafters, wrapped in a green canvas tarp that had faded to the color of old sage. The tarp crackled when he touched it, brittle with age. Whatever was inside had been there longer than he'd owned the house, longer than Margaret had been gone, maybe longer than their marriage itself. Arthur pulled the box free and descended the ladder with it tucked under one arm, ignoring the protest in his lower back. In the workshop light, he could see the tarp was actually an old army duffel bag, the kind issued to servicemen in the early 70s. His hands remembered that canvas texture before his mind did. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe 100, bound in rubber bands that disintegrated at his touch. The envelopes were addressed in his own handwriting, young and confident, before arthritis had turned his script into something cramped and cautious. They were all addressed to the same person, Elena Russo, followed by an address in Portland, Oregon, that he hadn't thought about in 50 years. Every single envelope was unopened, every single envelope was stamped, and every single one was marked "Return to Sender" in faded red ink. Arthur lowered himself onto his work stool, the one Margaret had bought him for his 65th birthday because she'd worried about him standing too long at the workbench. His chest felt tight, not the warning sign tightness that Dr. Patterson had taught him to recognize, but something older, something that had calcified inside him decades ago and was now cracking open. He picked up the envelope on top. The postmark read March 15, 1973. The return address was APO San Francisco, which meant he'd mailed it from Vietnam. His thumb slid under the flap, still sealed after all these years, and he pulled out 2 sheets of thin paper covered in his sprawling handwriting. "Dear Ellie," it began, "I know I have no right to write to you after what I did, but I need you to understand why I left. It wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I loved you too much to ask you to wait for someone who might not come back." Arthur's vision blurred. He set the letter down carefully as if it might shatter and reached for another envelope. Same result. Return to sender. He tried a third, a fourth, a dozen. Every single letter he'd written to Elena Russo from Vietnam had been returned unopened. Every attempt at explanation, every apology, every desperate declaration of love had been rejected before she'd even seen the words. Except he'd never received them back. He would have remembered, which meant someone else had intercepted them, collected them, and hidden them in an attic crawl space for half a century. The workshop suddenly felt smaller. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, the same irritating hum it had made for years, but now it seemed louder. Arthur stood and walked to the door, needing air, needing space, needing something he couldn't name. Outside, the clouds had cleared and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his small yard. The grass needed cutting one last time before winter, but he'd been putting it off. Everything lately felt like something he was putting off. Margaret had been gone 3 years now. The cancer had taken 18 months to finish what it started, and in that time they'd said everything that needed saying. Or so he'd thought. But Margaret had never mentioned finding a box of letters in the attic. She'd never asked about Elena Russo. She'd never given any indication that she knew he'd spent his entire marriage loving 2 women, one who was present and one who was a ghost. Unless she hadn't known. Unless these letters had been hidden by someone else entirely. Arthur walked back to his workbench and found his phone under a pile of sawdust and receipts. His son David answered on the third ring, his voice carrying that edge of concern it always had when his father called outside their regular Sunday schedule. "Dad, everything okay?" "I found something," Arthur said. "In the attic. I need to ask you something about your grandfather." A pause. David's breathing was audible through the speaker. "Grandpa Brennan died before I was born." "I know. That's why I'm asking. Did your mother ever mention that he and I didn't get along?" "She said you had differences, that he was hard on you. Why?" Arthur looked at the pile of letters, half a century of words that had never reached their destination. "Did she ever say anything about him interfering in my life before Vietnam?" Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, what did you find?" "Letters, a lot of letters. I wrote them to someone before I met your mother, and they all came back unopened. But I never saw them until today." David exhaled slowly. "Eleanor." The name hung in the air between them. Arthur's hand tightened on the phone. "How do you know that name?" "Mom told me once, when she was really sick, toward the end. She said there'd been someone before her, someone you'd loved when you were young. She said Grandpa Brennan had done something to make sure it didn't work out, but she never told me what. She said it didn't matter anymore because you'd chosen her and built a good life together." Arthur sat down again, his legs suddenly unreliable. Margaret had known. All those years she'd known about Eleanor, and she'd never said a word, never asked, never blamed him for the part of his heart he'd never fully surrendered. "Dad," David's voice pulled him back. "Are you okay?" "No," Arthur said honestly, "but I will be. I need to go, son." "Wait, what are you going to do?" Arthur looked at the letters again, decades of unread words. "I don't know yet. I'll call you Sunday." He ended the call before David could argue and picked up another envelope. This one was dated October 1973, 6 months after the first. "Dear Ellie, I'm coming home next month. I know you haven't answered any of my letters and I understand why. But I need to see you one more time. I need to tell you to your face that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life." He remembered writing that letter in a sweltering hooch outside Da Nang. Remembered the certainty he'd felt that once he got home, once he could explain everything face to face, Eleanor would understand, would forgive him, would take him back. But when he'd returned to Oregon in November 1973, Eleanor was gone. Her parents had sold their house and moved without leaving a forwarding address. His father had told him it was for the best, that he needed to move on, find a nice girl and settle down. His father had been particularly enthusiastic about Margaret Foster, the daughter of one of his business associates. Sweet girl, practical, good family. Arthur had married Margaret 8 months later. He told himself it was what made sense. He'd convinced himself that Eleanor had made her choice by not writing back, by disappearing. He'd built a decent life on that foundation of resignation. Except it had all been a lie. Eleanor had never received his letters. She'd never made a choice. His father had made the choice for both of them, intercepting every letter, returning them unopened, and hiding the evidence where Arthur would never find it. The rage came slowly, building like a storm system moving across flat land. Arthur stood and paced the length of his workshop, his hands clenching and unclenching. His father had been dead for 20 years. There was no confrontation to be had, no demand for explanation, no possibility of justice. Just letters and loss and the heavy weight of what might have been. He forced himself to breathe slowly, the way Dr. Patterson had taught him. In through the nose, out through the mouth, count to 4. The anger would solve nothing. His father was beyond reach. Margaret was beyond reach. The past was written and unchangeable. But Eleanor might not be. The thought arrived fully formed, shocking in its clarity. Eleanor might still be alive. She'd been 21 when he left for Vietnam, which would make her 72 now. The same age as him. Old, yes, but not impossibly old. People lived into their 90s now. She could be anywhere. She could be in Portland still. She could have a family, grandchildren, a whole life he knew nothing about. She could also be dead, a voice in his head reminded him. The voice sounded like Margaret, practical and gentle. You could spend weeks searching for someone who's been gone for years. What would that accomplish? But another voice, one that sounded younger and more reckless, pushed back. What if she's alive? What if she spent 50 years thinking you abandoned her without explanation? What if she deserves to know the truth? Arthur returned to the workbench and carefully gathered all the letters back into the deteriorated duffel bag. His hands were shaking slightly, the tremor that had been getting worse over the past year. He ignored it and carried the bag inside the house, setting it on the kitchen table next to the morning's newspaper and his half-empty coffee cup. The house was too quiet. It had been too quiet since Margaret died, but he'd gotten used to it, had even come to find comfort in the silence. Now it felt oppressive. The walls seemed to press in on him, filled with 40 years of memories that suddenly felt like they'd been built on sand. He made himself a sandwich he didn't eat and sat staring at the bag of letters until the winter dark fell outside. Then he opened his laptop, the one David had bought him last Christmas and taught him to use with patient repetition, and typed Eleanor Russo, Portland, Oregon, into the search box. 17 million results appeared in 0.6 of a second. Arthur scrolled through page after page of social media profiles, business listings, obituaries, and random mentions. There were dozens of Eleanor Russos, maybe hundreds, spread across the country and the world. None of the photos looked like the girl he remembered, but then again, 50 years changed everyone beyond recognition. He refined his search, adding details he remembered. Her father had been a pharmacist. They'd lived on the east side of Portland, near a park where they used to meet on summer evenings. She'd wanted to be a teacher, had been studying elementary education at Portland State when he'd gotten his draft notice. Nothing, or rather too much. Too many possibilities, too many dead ends, too many Eleanor Russos who could be her or could be complete strangers. Arthur closed the laptop and rubbed his eyes. The clock on the microwave read 10:15. He should go to bed. He should forget about this. He should accept that some things were meant to stay buried in the past. Instead, he picked up his phone and called David again. "Dad," his son's voice was thick with sleep. "It's late, what's wrong?" "I need to find her," Arthur said. "Eleanor. I need to know if she's still alive, and if she is, I need to give her these letters. I need her to know what happened." Silence on the other end, then a sigh. "Dad, it's been 50 years. I know how long it's been. Even if you find her, what makes you think she wants to hear from you? She might be married. She might have moved on completely. You could be opening old wounds for no reason. Or she might have spent her whole life thinking I abandoned her without a word." Arthur's voice was firm. "Your mother knew I never fully let Eleanor go. She lived with that ghost for 40 years and never complained. The least I can do is try to lay it to rest properly." Another pause. Okay, I'll help you. I know someone who does this kind of thing, finding people. Let me make some calls tomorrow. But Dad, don't get your hopes up. A lot can happen in 50 years. "I know, son, thank you." Arthur ended the call and sat in the kitchen until midnight, reading letter after letter by the dim light over the stove. Each one was a window into a younger version of himself, someone who believed in second chances and the power of explanation, someone who thought love could overcome anything if you just fought hard enough for it. He wasn't that person anymore. Vietnam had burned away that naive optimism, and marriage to Margaret had taught him that love was more about showing up every day than grand gestures. But reading these letters, he could remember what it felt like to believe, to hope, to think that somewhere in the world there was one person who understood you completely. The last letter in the stack was dated February 14, 1974, Valentine's Day, 3 months after he'd come home to find Eleanor gone. "Dear Ellie," it began. "This is the last letter I'll write. I'm getting married next month to a woman named Margaret Foster. She's kind and patient and deserves better than someone who can't stop loving a ghost. I want you to know that I will always wonder what our life could have been. I will always remember the way you laughed at my terrible jokes and how you made even ordinary moments feel like magic. I hope you're happy wherever you are. I hope you found someone who never left. All my love, Arthur. He'd written that letter but couldn't remember mailing it, couldn't remember making the decision to let go. But there it was, returned to sender, just like all the others. Even his final goodbye had been intercepted and hidden away. Arthur folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Then he carried the entire bag upstairs to his bedroom, set it on Margaret's old side of the bed, and lay down fully clothed on his own side. Through the window, he could see the neighbors' Christmas lights, red and green and white blinking in mindless rhythm. Margaret would understand what he was about to do. She'd always understood him better than he understood himself. That was the gift she'd given him, that patient understanding, that willingness to love him even when part of him was locked away in the past. But understanding wasn't the same as approval. If she were here, she'd probably tell him to leave it alone. She'd remind him that knowing the truth wouldn't change what had already happened. She'd point out that he was 72 years old with high blood pressure and a heart murmur, that chasing ghosts across the country was foolish at best and dangerous at worst. She'd be right too, she usually was. But Margaret wasn't here, and for the first time in 3 years Arthur felt something other than the dull ache of grief and routine. He felt purpose. Maybe it was selfish. Maybe it would end in disappointment or worse, but he needed to try. He fell asleep with his hand resting on the canvas bag, on 50 years of undelivered words, and dreamed of summer evenings in a Portland park, back when the future had seemed infinite and love had felt like something that could never break. The call from David came 4 days later. Arthur was in his workshop, pretending to organize tools while actually just moving them from one drawer to another, when his phone buzzed. "Dad, my guy found her, Alina Russo. Well, Alina Hartman now. She got married in 1976, widowed in 2019. She's living in Bellingham, Washington." Arthur's hand tightened on the phone. Bellingham, less than 300 miles away. All these years she'd been within driving distance. "Is she? How is she?" "I don't know details. My guy just does the finding part. But Dad, there's something else. According to the records, she's in a care facility. Mercy Ridge Assisted Living. That could mean anything from independent living to full nursing care." The workshop tilted slightly. Arthur sat down on his stool. "She's sick." "We don't know that. Lots of people move into those places for convenience, for community. Don't jump to conclusions." But Arthur's mind was already racing ahead. If Alina was in a care facility, it meant she was declining somehow. It meant time was running out if it hadn't already. He thought of his unread letters, of 50 years of explanations she'd never received, and felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. "Dad, you still there? I need the address, and her phone number if your guy found it." "I have the address, but Dad, you can't just show up. Let me call first, maybe set something up. We don't even know if she'd want to see you." "Then find out. Please, David, call them, ask if Alina Hartman is well enough for visitors. Tell them an old friend wants to reconnect." David sighed. "Fine, but I'm coming with you. If this is going to happen, I'm driving." "You have work, you have Sarah and the kids." "Sarah will understand. The kids are in school, and I'm not letting my 72-year-old father drive 300 miles alone to confront his long-lost love. That's how family road trip disasters start." Despite everything, Arthur smiled. "When did you get so bossy?" "I learned from the best. Give me until tomorrow to make arrangements. I'll pick you up Saturday morning." After David hung up, Arthur sat in the workshop for a long time, holding the phone and trying to imagine what he would say to Alina after 50 years. How did you apologize for abandoning someone when you hadn't actually done it? How did you explain that you'd spent your entire adult life believing she'd rejected you when the truth was that neither of them had been given a choice? And what if she didn't remember him? What if the care facility housed her body but her mind was already gone, lost to the same dementia that had taken his mother in her final years? What if he'd found her too late? Arthur pushed himself to his feet and walked back to the house. In the kitchen, he spread all the letters out on the table in chronological order. 143 letters spanning 8 months. He'd written to her almost every day from February to October 1973, and then sporadically after that until the final Valentine's Day letter in 1974. He'd been so young when he wrote these. Young and stupid and convinced that words could fix anything. Reading them now was like looking at a stranger who happened to share his handwriting. That Arthur had believed in destiny and soulmates and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. This Arthur knew better. This Arthur had buried a wife and raised a son and learned that life was mostly about endurance, about showing up day after day even when the magic was gone. But maybe that younger Arthur had been right about one thing. Some words needed to be said, even if they came 50 years too late, even if they changed nothing, even if the person you were saying them to couldn't fully hear them anymore. He gathered the letters carefully back into the duffel bag, along with one photograph he'd kept hidden in his desk drawer for decades. It showed him and Alina at 20, sitting on a bench in that Portland park, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her waist. They were both smiling like they'd never heard of war or distance or fathers who intercepted letters. Margaret had never asked about that photo. She'd probably never seen it. Arthur had kept it tucked away like everything else connected to Alina, a secret shame that had colored his entire marriage without his wife ever directly acknowledging it. Except she had acknowledged it at the end. She'd told David about Alina. She'd known about his father's interference. She'd lived with the ghost of his first love and never made him choose, never made him feel guilty, never asked him to burn these letters or throw away that photograph or stop wondering what might have been. Arthur pressed his palm against his chest, where the constant ache of missing Margaret lived. He'd loved her. God, he'd loved her in a way that was real and deep and true, but it had been a different kind of love than what he'd felt for Alina. Steadier, safer, built on partnership and children and shared history rather than the desperate intensity of first love. Was it wrong to go looking for Alina now that Margaret was gone? Was it a betrayal of 40 years of marriage to want closure on something that had ended before that marriage even began? He didn't know, but he knew he had to try. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Arthur was waiting on his front porch when David pulled up in his Subaru, 2 travel mugs of coffee in the cup holders and concern written across his face. "You sure about this, Dad?" Arthur climbed into the passenger seat, the duffel bag held carefully on his lap. "No, but I'm going anyway." They drove north through familiar territory first, past the strip malls and housing developments that had sprung up around Portland over the decades, past the suburban sprawl that had swallowed what used to be farmland. Arthur watched the landscape change through the window, remembering when these roads had been narrower, the traffic lighter, the world somehow bigger and smaller at the same time. "Tell me about her," David said after they'd been on the highway for an hour. "I know the basic story, but what was she really like?" Arthur considered the question. She was light. That's the best word I can think of. Everything felt lighter when she was around. She laughed at things that weren't particularly funny. She found joy in ordinary moments. "I was always so serious, so worried about doing the right thing, following the rules. Alina made me see that sometimes breaking the rules was the right thing." Sounds like the opposite of Mom. "Your mother was wonderful in different ways. She was solid, reliable. When I was with Margaret, I never worried about whether she'd be there. I knew she would be. With Alina, everything felt temporary, like we were living in a bubble that could pop at any moment." "And then it did." "And then it did." Arthur shifted the duffel bag on his lap. I got my draft notice in August 1972. We'd been together 2 years. I was 22, she was 21. We had plans. We were going to get married after I finished my teaching degree. She was going to teach elementary school. I was going to teach high school history. We'd buy a little house somewhere in Portland, have kids, grow old together. What happened? I panicked. My father had served in World War II, lost half his squad in France. He had nightmares about it my entire childhood. The thought of going to Vietnam, of maybe not coming back, of leaving Alina a widow at 21. I couldn't do that to her. So I told her I didn't think we should stay together. Told her she deserved someone who could give her the future we'd planned, not someone who might come back in a box. And she took it badly. She screamed at me, told me I didn't get to make that decision for her, told me she'd wait as long as it took. But I was convinced I was doing the noble thing, protecting her from grief. So I left, went to Vietnam, started writing letters the minute I got there, trying to explain, trying to apologize, trying to convince her to wait after all. But she never got them. No, my father intercepted every single one, returned them unopened. Let me come home thinking she'd refused to forgive me, that she'd moved on. By the time I got back, she was gone and my father was introducing me to Margaret. David was quiet for several miles. Did you love Mom? Yes, absolutely yes. It wasn't the same kind of love, but it was real. Your mother was my partner, my best friend. We built a good life together. I never regretted marrying her. But you never stopped wondering. No, I never stopped wondering. They crossed into Washington state as the winter sun climbed higher in a pale blue sky. Arthur watched the evergreen forest roll past, remembering a different journey in the opposite direction, coming home from Vietnam in November 1973, convinced he would find Alina and make everything right. He'd been so sure that the force of his feeling would be enough, that if he could just explain what had happened, why he'd left, she would understand, would forgive him, would take him back. Instead, he'd found an empty house and a for sale sign, and his father telling him it was all for the best, that Alina had clearly moved on, that he needed to do the same, that Margaret Foster was a nice girl from a good family and he should take her to dinner. And he had, because what else was there to do? You couldn't force someone to love you. You couldn't undo the past. You could only move forward, build something new, try to forget the roads not taken. Except the roads not taken had a way of haunting you. Every birthday, every anniversary, every milestone with Margaret, there had been a quiet voice in the back of his mind wondering what those moments would have been like with Alina instead. He'd learned to ignore that voice, to focus on what he had rather than what he'd lost, but it had never fully gone away. "We're about an hour out," David said, checking his GPS. "I called the facility yesterday, spoke to the administrator. Alina is in their memory care wing." Arthur's chest tightened. Dementia. They couldn't give me details because of privacy laws, but yeah, that's what memory care usually means. Dad, I don't know if she'll even recognize you. I know. Then why are we doing this? If she can't understand, if she won't remember, what's the point? Arthur looked down at the duffel bag, at 50 years of undelivered words. Because she deserves to know the truth, even if she can only hold onto it for a few minutes. Because I need to say it out loud to her face that I didn't abandon her, that I loved her, that my father stole something from both of us, and I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. You couldn't have known. No, but I could have tried harder to find her. I could have questioned my father's story. I could have done a lot of things differently. He paused. Your mother told you at the end that my father had interfered. Did she say anything else? David kept his eyes on the road. She said she was grateful, that if things had worked out between you and Alina, she never would have had you, never would have had me. She said sometimes the wrong paths lead to the right places. She was always better at acceptance than I was. She also said you should go find Alina someday, after she was gone. She said you'd spent 40 years wondering, and maybe it was time to get some answers. Arthur blinked against unexpected tears. Of course Margaret had said that. Of course she'd given him permission to do this, even from beyond the grave. She'd always known what he needed, sometimes before he knew it himself. They pulled into Mercy Ridge Assisted Living just after noon. The facility was nicer than Arthur had expected, a sprawling single-story building surrounded by landscaped gardens, now dormant for winter. A sign near the entrance advertised memory care, independent living, and respite services. Inside, the lobby was bright and warm, decorated for Christmas with a tree in one corner, and garlands strung along the reception desk. A woman in her 30s greeted them with practiced cheerfulness. "Welcome to Mercy Ridge. How can I help you?" "We're here to see Alina Hartman," David said. "I called earlier in the week." The woman's expression shifted to something more careful. "Are you family?" "Old friends," Arthur said. "Very old friends. I served with her late husband." The lie came easily, practiced in his mind over the past few days. "Let me check with our memory care director. Please have a seat." They sat on a couch near the Christmas tree, Arthur still clutching the duffel bag. Around them, elderly residents moved slowly through the lobby, some with walkers, some in wheelchairs, some moving independently but with that careful deliberation that came with age. Arthur tried to imagine Alina among them and couldn't. In his mind, she was still 21, still laughing at his terrible jokes, still whole and bright and untouched by time. "Mr. Brennan," a different woman approached, older, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. "I'm Susan Chen, the memory care director. I understand you're here to see Alina Hartman." Arthur stood, his knees creaking. "Yes, we were close a long time ago. I just learned she was here." Susan's eyes were kind but assessing. "I need to be honest with you. Alina has advanced Alzheimer's. She has good days and bad days, but even on good days, her long-term memory is extremely fragmented. She probably won't recognize you." "I understand." "She also tires easily. I can give you 15 minutes, maybe 20. And if she becomes agitated or confused, you'll need to leave immediately. Our primary concern is her well-being." "Of course." Susan led them through a locked door into the memory care wing. The halls here were quieter, painted in soft colors, with handrails running along both walls. Photographs of residents in their youth hung in frames, labels underneath identifying them by name and year. Arthur scanned them as they walked, looking for Alina's face among the strangers. They stopped outside a door marked Alina H. Susan knocked gently, then opened it without waiting for a response. "Alina, you have visitors. Some old friends came to see you." The room was small but pleasant, with a window overlooking the gardens and walls decorated with more photographs. An older woman sat in a recliner near the window, wrapped in a pink cardigan despite the warmth of the room. She looked up at them with vague interest, and Arthur's breath caught in his chest. Alina. It was unmistakably her, despite the 50 years that had carved lines around her eyes and mouth, despite the white hair where rich brown had been, despite the vacancy in her expression where sharp intelligence used to live. The bones of her face were the same, the shape of her hands, the slight tilt of her head when she was curious about something. "Hello," she said politely, the way you'd greet strangers. "Have we met?" Arthur couldn't speak. He stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of 50 years pressing down on him. This was Alina and also not Alina. The woman he'd loved was in there somewhere, buried under layers of forgetting, and he had no way to reach her. David touched his arm gently. "Dad." "I'm all right." Arthur stepped into the room, moving slowly so as not to startle her. "Hello, Alina. My name is Arthur Brennan. We knew each other a long time ago in Portland." She smiled, but there was no recognition in it. "Portland is nice. I lived there once, I think. Or was it Seattle? I get confused." "It was Portland. On the east side, near Laurelhurst Park. You used to meet me there on summer evenings after your classes at Portland State." Alina tilted her head, considering. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes like a light glimpsed through fog. I remember a park. There were ducks, and someone who told terrible jokes. Arthur's throat tightened. That was me. I told terrible jokes and you laughed at them anyway. Did I? She seemed pleased by this. I must have liked you very much. I liked you too, I still do. Susan cleared her throat softly. I'll give you some privacy. Just press the call button if you need anything. She left, closing the door most of the way behind her. David hung back near the door while Arthur moved closer to Alina. He set the duffel bag on the floor and pulled the single photograph from his pocket. I brought you something. A picture of us from 1972. He handed her the photograph. Alina held it carefully, studying the two young people captured in that frozen moment. We were beautiful, she said softly. Who are they? That's us, you and me 50 years ago. She looked up at him, then back at the photograph, trying to make the connection. 50 years is a long time. Yes, it is. Did we love each other? The question, asked with such innocent directness, broke something inside Arthur. Yes, very much. I loved you more than I knew how to say. Alina handed the photograph back to him. That's nice. It's good to be loved. She paused, her expression shifting to something troubled. I'm waiting for someone, I think. Someone who's supposed to come back, but I can't remember who. Arthur sat down in the chair next to her recliner, his legs suddenly weak. You were waiting for me. I left to go to war and I promised I'd come back, but I never did, not until now. That's very sad. Alina reached out and patted his hand, the gesture automatic, comforting someone she didn't remember. You must have had a good reason. I thought I did. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. They sat in silence for a moment. Through the window, Arthur could see other residents walking slowly through the gardens, bundled against the December cold. Somewhere in the building, someone was playing Christmas carols on a piano. The melody drifted faintly through Alina's door, something about being home for the holidays. I brought you letters, Arthur said finally. He picked up the duffel bag and set it on her lap. I wrote you every day when I was away. I tried to explain why I left, tried to tell you I still loved you, tried to ask you to wait for me. But you never got them. Someone sent them back without you seeing them. Alina unzipped the bag with trembling fingers and looked inside at the pile of envelopes. There are so many. 143, I counted. She pulled out a letter at random and tried to open it, but her hands couldn't manage the sealed flap. Arthur gently took it from her and opened it himself, then unfolded the thin paper and began to read aloud. Dear Ellie, it's been 3 weeks since I arrived in Vietnam, and I think about you every single day. Remember that Italian restaurant we used to go to, the one with the terrible breadsticks but amazing lasagna? I'd give anything for a plate of that lasagna and an hour with you right now. The food here is barely edible, and the company is either scared or trying too hard not to be scared. I miss your laugh. I miss the way you'd scrunch up your nose when you were concentrating on something. I miss everything. Alina listened with her eyes closed, a small smile on her face. When Arthur finished, she said, That's lovely. He must have cared about you very much. He's me, Alina. I wrote these to you. She opened her eyes and looked at him, confused. But you're here. You came back. Yes, I came back. He pulled out another letter and read it, then another, and another. Some made Alina smile. Some made her tear up without understanding why. And some she listened to with no reaction at all, as if the words were in a language she'd once known but had now forgotten. After the 8th or 9th letter, she grew tired. Her eyes started to close between sentences, and her attention drifted away to the window, to the piano music, to her own hands folded in her lap. I should let you rest, Arthur said, carefully folding the last letter and returning it to the bag. That's kind of you. Alina looked at him with the polite smile of someone thanking a helpful stranger. Will you come back? Do you want me to? She considered the question seriously. I think so. You have a nice voice, and those letters are very beautiful. Even if I don't remember who wrote them, I can tell they were written by someone who knew how to love. Arthur stood, his chest aching. He wanted to tell her everything. Wanted to explain about his father's interference, about the letters that never reached her, about the life they could have had together. Wanted to make her understand that she'd been loved, desperately and completely, even when distance and deception had kept them apart. But understanding wasn't possible anymore. The disease that was slowly erasing Alina's mind had already taken too much. The best he could offer was this, reading her love letters from a stranger who happened to be him. Giving her the words she should have received 50 years ago, even if she couldn't connect them to the person who'd written them. "I'll come back," he promised. "If you want me to, I'll come back as often as they'll let me." "That would be nice." Alina's eyes were already closing. "Thank you for visiting." Arthur left the room with the duffel bag, his vision blurred with tears. David was waiting in the hallway, and together they walked back through the locked doors, past the photographs of residents in their youth, through the cheerful lobby with its Christmas decorations. Outside, the winter air was sharp and clean. Arthur breathed deeply, trying to settle the storm of grief and rage and regret swirling inside him. He'd found Alina. She was alive. And she was already gone, her memories scattered like leaves in wind, their shared past erased as thoroughly as if it had never happened. "Dad," David's voice was gentle. "You okay?" "No," Arthur wiped his eyes. "But I will be. I just need a minute." They stood in the parking lot while Arthur pulled himself together. Around them, the world continued its indifferent turning. Cars drove past on the highway. Birds settled in the bare trees. The sun moved across the pale winter sky. "Thank you for bringing me," Arthur said finally. "I know it probably seems pointless, but I needed to see her. I needed to try." "It's not pointless," David said. "Maybe she won't remember tomorrow that you were here, but you'll remember. You'll know you tried to make it right." They got back in the car and drove toward home in silence. Arthur held the duffel bag on his lap, the weight of all those undelivered words somehow heavier now than before. He'd thought that giving Alina the letters would bring closure, would somehow resolve the 50-year-old wound that had never fully healed. Instead, he felt more lost than ever. That night back in his too-quiet house, Arthur couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Alina sitting in her pink cardigan, listening to letters from a stranger who claimed to have loved her, thinking about the life they could have built together if his father hadn't interfered, thinking about Margaret, who had loved him despite the ghost of Alina always hovering at the edges of their marriage. He'd been so certain that finding Alina would answer all his questions, would let him finally understand whether leaving her had been fate or tragedy, whether their love would have survived the distance and the war and the ordinary erosions of time. But Alina couldn't give him those answers anymore. The person she'd been at 21 was gone, and the person she was now could barely remember her own name. Around 2 in the morning, Arthur got up and went to his workshop. He turned on the fluorescent lights and pulled out the box of photographs from his marriage. Margaret at 30, holding newborn David. Margaret at 40, laughing at something outside the frame. Margaret at 60, graying but still beautiful, still patient with his moods and silences. He'd loved her. He needed to remember that, needed to hold on to it. Finding Alina didn't diminish what he'd had with Margaret. Different didn't mean less. The life he'd built hadn't been a consolation prize or a second choice. It had been real and good and worth living. But the might-have-been still haunted him. They would always haunt him now, made more painful by the knowledge that it hadn't been Alina's choice to disappear. Someone had stolen that choice from both of them, had manipulated events to ensure they'd never have a chance to find out if their love could survive. Arthur looked at the duffel bag sitting on his workbench. 143 letters full of words Alina would never fully understand. He could throw them away now. He'd shown her the letters, read her some of them. The purpose had been served, such as it was. But he couldn't do it. These letters were all that remained of that younger version of himself, the one who'd believed in forever and soulmates and love conquering all. Destroying them would be like admitting that person had been a fool, that the love he'd felt had been an illusion. Instead, Arthur made a decision. He would go back to Mercy Ridge. He would visit Alina as often as they'd allow. He would read her the letters, all 143 of them, even though she wouldn't remember who wrote them or why. He would give her the words that had been stolen from her 50 years ago, and if she could only hold on to them for minutes or hours before forgetting again, that would have to be enough. It was the only way he knew to make peace with the past, to give Alina what she was owed, even if she couldn't fully receive it, to finally lay the ghost that had haunted him for half a century. The next Saturday, Arthur drove back to Bellingham alone. David had offered to come, but Arthur insisted he needed to do this himself. He arrived at Mercy Ridge mid-morning and found Susan Chen in the memory care wing. "Mr. Brennan," she said, surprised, "I wasn't expecting you back so soon. I'd like to visit Alina again, if that's all right." Susan studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "She won't remember you were here last week." "I know. This is going to be hard, watching someone you love forget you over and over." "I know that too, but I need to do this. She deserves to hear these letters even if she can't remember them. They were meant for her 50 years ago and she never got them. I'm just trying to correct a very old mistake." Susan's expression softened. "Come with me, but Mr. Brennan, this isn't sustainable long-term. You're going to wear yourself out driving 6 hours every week to visit someone who doesn't know you." "Maybe, but it's what I need to do right now." Alina was in the common room this time, sitting at a table near a window, working on a jigsaw puzzle. She looked up when they approached, the same polite smile she'd given him last week. "Hello," she said. "Do I know you?" "We met last Saturday. My name is Arthur. I brought you some letters." "Letters?" Her face brightened. "I like letters. Are they for me?" "They were written for you a long time ago. Would you like me to read them to you?" "That would be lovely." So Arthur sat down across from her and began to read. He read her stories from Vietnam, descriptions of monsoon rains and impossible heat, and the constant low hum of fear. He read her memories of Portland, of that Italian restaurant and summer evenings in the park. He read her promises and apologies and desperate declarations of love. Alina listened with varying degrees of attention. Sometimes she seemed engaged, responding to the emotions in the letters even if she couldn't connect them to anything concrete. Sometimes her mind wandered, and she'd interrupt to ask about the puzzle she was working on or mention something about lunch, but she never asked him to stop reading. After an hour, Susan came to tell him it was time to go. Alina looked up from her puzzle, already forgetting the letters, and said, "Thank you for visiting. Will you come back?" "Yes," Arthur promised, "next week." And he did. Every Saturday for the next 6 months, Arthur drove to Bellingham and read Alina letters. Some days she recognized him from previous visits. Most days she didn't. It didn't matter. He read to her anyway, working his way slowly through the duffel bag, giving her the words that had been meant for her all along. The staff at Mercy Ridge got used to seeing him. Susan Chen stopped questioning his visits and started saving the best time of day for them, the late morning hours when Alina was most alert. Some of the other residents started to gather around when Arthur read, enjoying the love story even if they couldn't quite follow the details. Arthur's son worried about him. David called every Sunday to check in, to suggest maybe it was time to move on, to gently point out that Alina wasn't getting better and all this driving was taking a toll. But Arthur kept going. Because somewhere in those letters, in the act of reading them aloud to a woman who couldn't fully receive them, Arthur found something he hadn't expected. Not closure exactly, not healing, but a kind of peace. He'd spent 50 years carrying the weight of what might have been, convinced that he'd destroyed his one chance at true love. But sitting with Alina week after week, watching her smile at beautiful sentences she couldn't place, seeing her react to emotions even when the context was lost, he began to understand something Margaret had probably known all along. Love didn't require memory to be real. It didn't need the person loving and the person loved to be perfectly aligned in understanding. It just needed to exist, to be spoken, to be given freely even when nothing could be expected in return. He'd loved Alina when they were young, and he'd loved Margaret through their marriage, and now he loved Alina again in this different way, this gentler way, this way that asked for nothing back. And somehow that was enough. On a Saturday in late June, Arthur arrived at Mercy Ridge to find Susan waiting for him in the lobby, her face grave. "Mr. Brennan, I need to talk to you before you go in. Alina had a stroke last night. She's stable now, but her cognition has declined significantly. She probably won't be able to follow the letters anymore." Arthur felt something settle in his chest, heavy and final. "Can I still see her?" "Of course, but I wanted you to be prepared." Alina was in her room, lying in the hospital bed that had replaced her recliner. Her eyes were open but unfocused, tracking slowly across the ceiling. When Arthur sat down beside her and took her hand, she didn't react. "Hello, Alina," he said softly. "It's Arthur. I brought more letters today." No response, just the slow rise and fall of her breathing, the distant look in her eyes. Arthur pulled out a letter anyway and began to read. "Dear Ellie, I saw the most incredible sunset tonight, all purple and orange and gold. It reminded me of the one we watched from that hill overlooking Portland, the night I told you I loved you for the first time. Remember how the whole city seemed to glow? Remember how you said it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something beautiful to happen?" Alina's eyes closed. Arthur kept reading, his voice steady despite the tears running down his face. He read through sunset and into evening, through letter after letter, until only a handful remained in the duffel bag. When the last letter was read, Arthur sat holding Alina's hand in the growing darkness. Outside the window, the summer garden was lush and green, so different from the bare branches of that first winter visit. 6 months of Saturdays. 6 months of words finally delivered, even if they'd arrived too late to matter. "I'm sorry," Arthur whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to find you. I'm sorry I believed my father's lies. I'm sorry we lost 50 years." Alina's breathing changed, became quieter. Her fingers twitched slightly in his hand. And then, so softly he almost missed it, she spoke. "Arthur." He froze. "I'm here, Ellie, I'm right here." Her eyes opened, and for just a moment, a single perfect moment, they were clear, focused, present. She looked at him and saw him, really saw him, for the first time since that first visit 6 months ago. "You came back," she said. "Yes, I came back. I'm sorry it took so long." Alina smiled, and it was the smile he remembered from 50 years ago, full of light, full of forgiveness. "I waited." I know you did." "The letters were beautiful." "You remember them." "No," her smile softened. "But I remember you. I always remembered you, somewhere deep down. I was just waiting for you to come back and remind me why." Arthur raised her hand to his lips, unable to speak through his tears. Alina's eyes started to drift closed again, the clarity fading as quickly as it had come. "Don't leave," she whispered. "Never again," Arthur promised. "I'm not going anywhere." He stayed with her through the night, holding her hand, occasionally reading sections of letters when the silence felt too heavy. Dawn came slowly, painting the room in shades of pink and gold, and somewhere between one breath and the next, Alina slipped away. Arthur felt her go, felt the subtle change in the air, the way her hand went slack in his, the way the presence that had animated her body for 73 years simply departed. He sat with her for a long time after, not ready to let go, not ready to make it final. When he finally called for the nurse, The sun was fully up and the summer birds were singing in the garden. Susan came, along with two other staff members, and they were gentle with him. They didn't rush him. They let him say goodbye at his own pace. "She recognized you," Susan said softly, "at the end. That almost never happens with Alzheimer's, but I heard her say your name. She knew you." Arthur nodded, unable to speak. He gathered up the empty duffel bag, now light without its burden of letters, and walked out of Mercy Ridge for the last time. David met him in the parking lot. Arthur had called him in the early morning hours, and his son had driven up immediately. They stood together in the summer sunshine, and Arthur let himself cry for everything he'd lost and found and lost again. "I'm sorry, Dad," David said. "Don't be. She waited for me, David. For 50 years, even after she forgot why, even after she forgot my name, some part of her was still waiting. And I got to be there at the end. I got to keep my promise." They drove home in silence. Arthur stared out the window at the passing landscape, thinking about Alina's last smile, her final moment of clarity. Thinking about Margaret, who had given him permission to do this, who had understood what he needed even before he did. That evening, alone in his workshop, Arthur built a box. A simple wooden box, carefully sanded and stained, with brass hinges and a lock that worked smoothly. Inside, he placed all 143 letters, along with a photograph of him and Alina at 20. He added Margaret's wedding ring, which he'd kept in his desk since her death, and a picture of his wife holding baby David. These were his ghosts, his might-have-beens and his actuality, his lost love and his found life. And they belonged together in this box, pieces of a story that had taken a lifetime to complete. He locked the box and placed it on the highest shelf in his workshop, where it would be safe but not forgotten. Someday, David would find it and try to make sense of the contents. Maybe he'd understand. Maybe he wouldn't. It didn't matter. The letters had served their purpose. Outside, the summer evening was warm and gentle. Arthur walked into his backyard and sat on the bench Margaret had insisted they buy for their 40th anniversary. The same bench where they'd sat together countless times, watching the sun set, planning their retirement, simply existing in comfortable silence. He wasn't alone. He could feel Margaret beside him, her patient presence, her quiet understanding. And somewhere, in some way he didn't fully comprehend, Alina was there too. Not the confused woman in the care facility, but the girl from the park, laughing at his terrible jokes. Both loves, both real, both part of him in ways that couldn't be untangled or ranked or chosen between. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange and gold. Just like that sunset in Portland all those years ago, when the world had held its breath waiting for something beautiful to happen. And in the end, Arthur thought, something beautiful had happened. Not the story he'd expected. Not the love that followed the rules or the romance that defied all obstacles, but something real nonetheless. Something that had spanned decades and distance and even death itself. He'd loved Alina. He'd loved Margaret. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the opportunities lost or the years stolen or the words undelivered. Just the simple fact of having loved and been loved in whatever forms life allowed. Arthur sat on the bench until the stars came out, surrounded by ghosts and memories and the quiet certainty that he'd done what he could. That he'd fought for love in all its messy, complicated forms. That he'd kept his promises, even the ones that came 50 years too late. And when he finally went inside, into the house that had held 40 years of marriage and 3 years of grief, and now this strange new peace, he found he could breathe a little easier, sleep a little deeper, live with a little less regret. The letters were delivered, the words were spoken, the promises were kept, and Alina, wherever she was now, finally knew the truth. She had been loved, desperately, completely, across decades and distance and all the barriers that time and circumstance and interfering fathers could construct. She had been loved, and that, Arthur thought as he turned out the lights and climbed the stairs to bed, had always been the only story worth telling.